Hello, everyone. My name is Sandra Collins, and I'm the Director of the National Library of Ireland. And it's my great honour to welcome you all this evening to this online event, the third in our Living with Pride programme. Living with Pride is a flagship project for the National Library this year. It represents a commitment to diversity and inclusion, and specifically to LGBTI+. We hope that through this project that we will raise awareness of the Irish Queer Archive and the LGBTI+ collections which we care for in the National Library. That also includes the Marriage Equality Campaign papers, the Born Digital Marriage Equality Photographic Archive of more than 6,000 digital photos, and a collection of 49 websites related to the marriage equality referendum. These collections form part of the memory of Ireland, and it is an honour to hold them in trust and to find ways to explore and promote them, and to encourage people to engage with and be inspired by them. There are a number of elements to Living with Pride. Today is the third in the Living with Pride year-long programme of events. This programme is co-curated by Tonie Walsh, and it is ambitious and wide-ranging. And we're looking forward to the many conversations and reflections that this programme will undoubtedly create. In June, very soon, we will launch the Living with Pride exhibition. This is an exhibition of the Christopher Robson Photographic collection, and that collection contains over 2,000 slides, mostly taken at Pride events in Ireland between 1992 and 2007. The collection was donated to us by Christopher's partner, Bill Foley, and Bill has worked to co-curate the exhibition with us. The photographs are fully digitised and available to view in our online catalogue, and the exhibition will be on site in the National Photographic Archive in Temple Bar, and also online for people to explore wherever they're based and regardless of the COVID-19 situation at the time. We're also delighted to be partnering with Curt International Festival of Literature, and we'll have Sean Hewitt as our first poet in residence based at the Irish Queer Archive, exploring some of the stories contained in that archive through poetry. Overall, our approach throughout to developing Living with Pride has been guided by the principle of nothing about us without us. And I'm very grateful to our co-curators and partners, and to Shout Out, who provided training for our teams. I also want to thank the great staff in the National Library who've worked so hard on this. We recognise that there's much more work to do in our diversity and inclusion programme, and that's something that we're continuing to work on in the coming years. So now it's my great pleasure and an honour to introduce our co-curator and chair this evening, Tonie Walsh. Tonie is an archivist, journalist and activist, and he has been at the forefront of LGBT civil rights on the island of Ireland since 1979. He cut his teeth as a journalist at Out magazine, Ireland's first commercial gay periodical, and in 1988 he co-founded GCN magazine. In 1997, he reorganised the archive holdings of the National LGBT Federation into what would later become known as the Irish Queer Archive. This collection was then transferred to state ownership in the National Library of Ireland in 2008. Tonie has recently launched a campaign to build an Irish AIDS memorial, and the campaign is currently at community consultation stage with the support of local government and Leinster House. Tonie's working on a number of research and writing projects, and we're very delighted that he agreed to co-curate this programme of events at the National Library. So thank you, Tonie. Over to you.
Thanks very much, Sandra, for that lovely introduction, and also a reminder of the value and reach of the Irish Queer Archive collection at the National Library of Ireland. To all of you watching, it's great to have your company. I'm really excited about this evening's session. Sadly, it's only going to be an hour long because I know we have a stellar panel and we could actually talk, well, they could talk all evening. But to let you know how we're going to plan the next hour, I will introduce our panelists and then invite them to talk about their role in the various campaigns that led up to the vote on marriage equality in 2015. And then later on, we will actually take a moment to reflect on the distance we've traveled in the six years and have some evaluation of the place we find ourselves in right now, and also ask the very necessary question, what unfinished business is there? We will, of course, make space at the end of the hour for your questions. So if you have anything, read is on hand from the National Library of Ireland, get those into you. It gives me great pleasure to introduce our panel. First of all, Brian Sheehan. He was the co-director of the very successful Yes Equality civil society campaign. But he's been involved for many, many years in a range of advocacy, community and cultural LGBT organizations, stretching back over decades. He was the executive director of GLEN, that's the Gay and Lesbian Equality Network, which was an umbrella group set up in 1988 to campaign first and foremost for decriminalization and then to advance equality and anti-discrimination legislation, which ultimately culminated with civil partnership bill in the mid-noughties, and that was, of course, followed by marriage equality. Brian was chair of GLEN for 9 years, during which time the organization delivered significant advancements in equality for LGBT people in laws and policy covering education, mental health, sexual health, workplace, far-ranging legal changes in relationships and families. He was a board member and co-chair of ILGA Europe. That's the Brussels-based umbrella advocacy organization that covers Europe and LGBT organizations in Europe and Central Asia. Along with Ron, we've got Lisa Connell, who's worked with GCN magazine since 2008 and was appointed managing editor to great acclaim, I should say, in March 2019. She's the co-founder of Mother, Queer Club Night in Dublin, and has been a lifelong equality activist, of which we're going to hear more later. Lisa was co-founder of LGBT Noise, and Noise and Equals, both organisations were set up to advocate for access to equal marriage in Ireland. Lisa promotes both the charitable objectives of Ireland's national LGBTQ press, that's GCN, and ensures the commercial viability of the business. No easy task over the last year, and it's to Lisa and her team's credit at GCN that they've managed to actually survive through the pandemic and grow GCN across a load of digital media platforms. She's worked in the community sector and in the LGBT activism for 13 years. And as she told me herself earlier on, she believes strongly in people power. It's the old feminist mantra at work there, and community collaboration to enact social change. Our third panelist this evening is Dr. Gráinne Healy, who is a co-founder and chairwoman of Marriage Equality Ireland for over a decade. She was a co-director of Yes Equality. There is a distinction which they will explain to you later. Yes Equality, that was the campaign which led and won the marriage equality referendum campaign in May 2015. And of course, she didn't lose a heartbeat by co-authoring Ireland Says Yes, How the Referendum Was Won, that's 2015 publication, and edited Crossing the Threshold, the Story of Marriage Equality Movement 2017, and the author of Good Practice Guide on Values-Based Campaigning for Legal Recognition of Same-Sex Relationships. That's a Council of Europe publication that came out 5 or 6 years ago. actually a very important publication in terms of addressing the needs and desires of LGBT organizations and advocacy groups in other countries in Europe. Again, something I hope we have time to touch on during our 1 hour discussion. Gráinne has a slew of awards to her, including Dublin University's President's Award for Engagement. But she was also awarded the DCU Outstanding Contribution to Society Alumni Award in 2016 and has a long history of involvement with the National Women's Council of Ireland. In fact, you chaired it at one point, didn't you, Gráinne?
I did. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So that's our panel. And Brian, I'm going to turn to you because you helmed GLEN, as I mentioned earlier on, for several years, and of course, GLEN is the elder statesperson in our set of advocacy organisations. Can you take us back to the moment when, I suppose it was after decriminalisation, when GLEN decided to set its focus on civil partnership and relationship recognition?
Hello, Tonie, and hello to everyone listening. Thanks very much to the National Library for having us. And it's actually great in Zoom times to have a Zoom call that's actually really interesting, I hope, for people. GLEN is, I suppose there's a couple of things. One is long before I came along to GLEN and other organisations, many people had their shoulder to the wheel in driving uphill, like Sisyphus. The huge engine needed to drive change, and those certainly were the early people involved, yourself and many others, Tonie, for a long time. And in GLEN terms, it's Christopher Robson, who Sandra talked about earlier, but also Kieran Rose, Owen Collins, Maura Malloy, Ursula Barry, people who initially and lots of others, who set around establishing an organisation that focused on political advocacy and using that as a specific strategy to try and achieve change. And GLEN had, if you like, two goals. One is that LGBT people would be unremarkable and valued. And by unremarkable, we meant that you could go about your ordinary life without being remarked on, whether it was school, work, whatever. But that also there would be full and equal participation for LGBT people across every aspect of Irish life: economic, social, cultural, political, community. And I suppose our sense was that you did that in a number of ways. Equality laws, which were crucial. You had to recognise loving relationships. You had to recognise families. You had to recognise LGBTI people in health, in mental health, sexual health, as Tonie, you and many others had been driving for years in terms of HIV and AIDS, but sexual health generally. So there was a huge sense of optimism after decriminalisation. It allowed more people to be out than were ever before. It allowed employment equality laws followed fairly quickly in 93. That allowed people to be safe in their jobs. And if you're safe in your job, you actually have a little bit of space to become involved in activism and to drive change yourself. And I think those incremental changes in many areas were really crucial, and GLEN was behind some of them. Many, many people were behind those changes. The trade union movement was phenomenal in employment equality, but each step was incremental in building space for change, right? And then you came to relationships and families, and that was always core. Because that was the thing that sustains so many people, your loving relationships and families, your children, your parents, your grandparents. The whole family should be recognised based on who you are. And we pursued, it was very interesting. Marriage was always set as the goal. The challenge was how to get there. We'll talk a little later about varying strategies to get there. It had emerged in the US. It had setbacks in the US. It had emerged in Holland. I can't remember the year, but early 90s, I think. But that was it, really. So we were looking for what's politically achievable at a particular point in time while building. Each thing is about incremental building. And actually, it's 10 years ago last month that the first civil partnership was in Ireland, Barry Dignam and Hugh Walsh. And at the time, it's quite hard, we'll talk about it maybe later, it's quite hard to remember that getting civil partnership passed notwithstanding some challenges in it, was a phenomenal thing that the politicians never ever imagined would be done and could be done. And nobody anywhere except ourselves, and by ourselves I mean collectively, we're saying, well, marriage is now possible. And I remember our press release the day after civil partnership was the only thing left in this context was was families and constitutional equality, and constitutional equality was marriage. But it's a really interesting thing is that, and the government brought in civil partnership following very intensive lobbying over in the depths of the most awful recession, 2009, 2010. And the phenomenal thing that happened after that was that lesbian and gay couples up and down the country had their partnerships. And I remember the Longford Leader had above the fold quarter-page photograph of the very first couple in Longford having a civil partnership. And I think one of the milestones, the incremental milestones was, and I'll stop at this, was the lesbian and gay couple who had civil partnerships in public, in the media, in all parts of Ireland, that suddenly the gays were not up in Dublin anymore. They were everywhere. We were everywhere. And I think those are fundamental building blocks, as well as all of the activism all across the country that helped us build towards marriage. But I'll stop there because, like, Gráinne and Lisa have an enormous amount to say.
For people who aren't familiar with the history of GLEN, the Gay and Lesbian Equality Network, it should be noted that it's possibly a singular template in Ireland for a well-run professional LGBT advocacy organization that managed to actually develop extremely successful relationships across every part of Irish society as part of advancing its various goals. And that also included actually developing really good relationships with people in government. Now, there was a criticism at a certain point, and this is where I want to bring you in, Lisa. There was a criticism at a certain point during the campaign for civil partnership that, in fact, you were too close. GLEN was too close to the government. And I'll let you, I invite you to come back and actually talk about that later in the conversation. But Lisa, you were involved with setting up Noise and Equals because you were part of a demographic of LGBT people that felt that we weren't moving quickly enough as a community. We weren't moving quickly enough to embrace the need for marriage equality. Is that the case?
I mean, I've always been pretty impatient. I mean, I think that obviously what we all know to be true is that actually every player had their part, and it wouldn't have happened with one singular strand or one singular strategy. And so actually you need a kind of a very bolshy, bossy LGBTQ plus person who doesn't mind tying themselves to the gates of the Dáil or pretending they're going to do some work and climbing up on the pillar a la Will St. Ledger. So yeah, we came in at a time and at a juncture where it was, I have huge acknowledgement that we were running because someone else had walked, and we were emboldened to do that work and to be critical and to be, a pain in the ass when we needed to be. Really Noise actually was born after Labour. There was a candlelit vigil for the Civil Unions Bill had been rejected out of the Seanad. And I went to the pub, as we all do. You go to the pub after the protest, and myself and my friend Annie Hanlon, I was so mad. I was just so cross. And I said, like, what the hell? Why are we being all so bloody polite? And, we got to start making some noise. And of course, like any good gay, I think that nobody else has had a unique thought in their life before. So that night we were... But you need that. So you need that fire in the belly, and you need that anger and irritation in order to come at it from a different vantage point. And also, GLEN were doing the lobbying because at the time I wouldn't have even known how to get a meeting with a TD. So so it's And that's the thing as well. I think any robust campaign there needs to be a diversity of voices as well, because we're not a homogenous unit. So it needed that. It needed that pressure. And I think I certainly, from an organizational perspective, I think we all understood each other's kind of raison d'etre,
Yeah, Gráinne, both Lisa and Brian have spoken of how they've harnessed the respective demographics that were represented by GLEN and Noise and Equals. And was it something similar for you with marriage equality? And I'd like you to sort of like take us through the early days of marriage equality, and then I'd love the three of you to jump in, but I'd particularly love to hear about how GLEN and marriage equality coalesced into the Yes Equality campaign, because that's a very interesting process as well. And again, too, for students of social history and political agitation, it's a very interesting case study. But take us back, please, to the early days of marriage equality.
Yeah, well, the spark that set the marriage equality flame alight was Catherine Zappone and Anne Louise Gilligan deciding to get married in Canada, where you could do so without being domicile, and coming back to Ireland and putting it up to the revenue commissioners to say, we're a married couple, will you recognise us for tax purposes? So that was the basis of their case. Every other heterosexual couple who went and got married anywhere came back and presented themselves in that same way. And the revenue commissioners would say, yeah, you have your cert, you're married, we will treat you in that way. So Catherine and Anne Louise knew, obviously, that was not going to happen for them. So they brought a few of us around a dinner table, and within 2 weeks of that dinner, I was chair of a thing called marriage equality. There was a group of us around the table who were tasked with raising funds to support them. Like they were some operators, those women, they were just brilliant the way they were able to get people to do their bidding. And I was very happy to do their bidding, I have to say. They were wonderful women, and with the kind of vision and foresight to pull together people who would be able to, we knew very quickly that just having a campaign to support Catherine and Anne Louise was not going to be enough. We needed a strategy. So Denise Charlton and myself were the co-founders of Marriage Equality. Within a year, we'd gotten some money from Atlantic to allow us to begin to build an organisation with staff, with structure, and pretty much, my background was in the women's movement as a feminist. I'd been chair of the National Women's Council, vice president of the European Women's Lobby. I'd sat on the Equality Authority. So I had a good sense of how power shifts in Ireland and how you organise in a way to bring about change. And many of us who joined Marriage Equality, Alva Smith, Denise Charlton, I've mentioned, Orla Howard, Chris Robson, who was with us for a period, we really did attract some really heavy thinkers who were able to say strategically, this is the route we need to go down if we want to achieve marriage equality. In the first instance, nobody in the country, apart from the gays, had any idea that there was such a thing as marriage equality. So we had to educate the gays, we had to educate the community, we had to bring people on board. And then because of the different demographics, so we had Anna McCarthy from Noise was on marriage equality for a period. So we recognised that having the various elements speaking to different demographics from the earliest times was really important in building what really in the first instance was an awareness raising campaign. We had hoped we could just push the government to legislate. Despite the fact that we must have bullied every senior council in the country, we couldn't get them to agree that, legislation would not end up down in the four courts and it would not be challenged. So at this time, GLEN were pursuing civil partnership. We strategically didn't want to go that route. We wanted what we saw as the full equality package. They took their route. They were successful in achieving it. And I would give the nod to the point that Brian made. There is no doubt that as particularly not just people outside Dublin, but as families began to have members who were going to what they were calling the wedding of their sons and daughters who were having civil partnerships, there was a sense of, Jesus, the sky's not falling. Actually, and why not give them the full shilling? So that became, I think, an important part of the narrative.
Can I also say it's good to remind people that it's, when you three were actually doing your stuff, that it was trying to advance it, particularly when on the cusp of the introduction of civil partnership in 2010, was it? Civil partnership was in, the civil partnership bill was 2012, and that came on the back of David Norris's unsuccessful bill that he tried to introduce himself a few years earlier. But it's good to remind people that it wasn't, for a long time, it wasn't a foregone, marriage equality wasn't a foregone conclusion. In spite of the extraordinary advocacy that you're all doing. Brian, do you have any comments on that?
Well, Gráinne, I'll tell you, there were very few politicians in Leinster House who thought we'd win the referendum. There were very few political journalists, and Gráinne and I had meetings with a number of them, who thought we were daft, and who didn't think, who thought we weren't at the race, thought we were daft. And even highly respected ones just thought, look, this isn't going to win, it'll be ridiculous. Do you know what I mean? We're on divorce one territory. So for those who don't remember, in the 1996? No, 86, there was a divorce referendum that everyone was going to win and didn't, right? Overnight, certain politician threw their oar into it and upset it overnight, even though it looked like it was. So people were saying that's the territory. Referendums in Ireland are incredibly difficult fish, right? And actually, I think that's a useful moment to mention, Noel Whelan. So Noel, who very unfortunately died 2 years ago, was a huge anchor in the Yes Equality campaign. He was instrumental in ensuring that the three organisations of Marriage Equality, GLEN, and the Irish Council for Civil Liberties, who came together under the Yes Equality banner, kept our eye on the ball, right? The only goal, the only game in town was winning that referendum. One vote would do, but we knew we would have to fight for every single vote. And Gráinne wrote down our strategy after a couple of meetings on one page. And the bottom line of it, I always remember and still use. And it was basically we're fighting this, we're looking after it, and everything else is not our business.
It's not our business. That's right.
The only thing that mattered was winning the referendum, and for two reasons. One, because we had to win it, because a loss would do incredible damage to the well-being of LGBTI people in Ireland and elsewhere, right? And that was a massive responsibility. I think every single person involved in it understood, right? But secondly, because how do you get out? We collectively had worked together. So civil partnership was in, which had almost all the rights and entitlements in a legal context for a couple. We had worked very hard together to get the Children and Family Relationships Act passed in 2015, which in law, at least as was written down, recognised LGBT-headed families and provided certainty and security for their children. We'll come back to that when we talk about what's left, right? So at least those two bits were in place. That was the insurance policy that we never, ever, ever wanted to cash. But I do remember that piece was, and I think Noel Whelan was an anchor. And when Noel became involved, others looked at us differently. I think you'd agree, Gráinne.
Yeah. And also, Noel had the experience of winning referenda, and Brian and I had experience of running. I mean, I've been involved in the earlier divorce referenda. I've been involved in reproductive rights campaign for my sins over the years, and Brian had been involved in others, but neither of us had actually headed up a referendum campaign. And Noel's, Bible around this was, we were used to being advocacy groups. Marriage equality was going around the country, talking to people, raising awareness. We had done a lot of getting people to speak about being in an LGBT-headed family, hearts and minds. But Noel was very clear about the difference between, as he would say, do you want to win a referendum? Or do you want to win an argument? Because we were all very good at winning an argument, and God knows we'd beaten each other up with arguments over the guts of 10 years when we differed on strategy. But the question was, and we used to say this at meetings, particularly within the sector, do you want to win an argument or do you want to win a referendum? Because the strategies are entirely different. And I think that's what Noel taught us. So everything from the tone of a referendum, you could be on the back of a lorry asking people to support marriage equality, and you could be roaring and shouting and getting great cheers. To win a referendum, you had to soften your tone, you had to soften your voice. You had to think, who am I trying to convince here? And we were trying to convince Mrs. Smith in Mullingar, the famous Mrs. Smith in Mullingar, who possibly had a couple of kids, had never really thought about gay marriage, as she might term it, but she was fair-minded. So she would look at the spokespersons in the campaign, and we were very careful about who we put out. And she would say, do I like her? Does she seem sensible? She certainly wouldn't be listening to anybody, including the gays, shouting at her and telling her how to vote. That's not how you win referenda. So I think Noel taught us that. And that was the core of the book that we co-wrote. It was about those lessons we learned about. And, you know, you can see the more recent, the Repeal the Eighth. They took the playbook that we developed and they finessed it to a fine art. And I think Noel Whelan is at the base of so much of that thinking.
It's extraordinary to hear how much has been learned from that process. But like 6 years on, it was almost this week, 6 years ago, Ireland voted by 62% majority to introduce marriage equality, change the landscape. Lisa, I want to ask you, I mean, you've got your finger on the pulse as managing editor of GCN, Ireland's major queer print media. So you're aware of the conversations that people are having, especially a younger generation are having about pressing needs and concerns. What do you think the legacy of the referendum has been, and also too, and I'll invite you all to be part of this conversation, to touch on unfinished business, I suppose. Where are we at with unfinished business? Because it's worth noting, there seems to be a lazy assumption in some quarters in Ireland that marriage equality settled the question of LGBT rights and acceptance in Ireland. And any of us who've got any skin in the game know that that's not the case at all. So I'd like to hear all of your take on it. But Lisa, yes, the enduring legacy of marriage equality, and again, maybe you could enumerate the issues that are facing us now in terms of tidying up the business of marriage equality.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, you know, it's interesting because the legacy is complicated, actually, because I think we're now far enough away, and we've given it enough time where we can name some things that maybe a lot of people don't know, which is that it was really hard for LGBTQ plus folks, and it came at a great cost. Literally, figuratively, but the impact is a lot. And I've seen, interestingly, particularly last year and this year, I think people who felt very hurt by it are able to name that more than they ever have been, particularly LGBTQ plus folks. And I actually really think that's great that people are able to say it now, because it shows that it's a complicated social change is a complicated business, and that there is a lot of collateral damage along the way. And I think that, like, to give you a small example, I'm loving watching Reeling in the Years, this new season, although it should come with a content warning just for pure PTSD. But obviously, very beautifully, they had 2015 was there, and March. The referendum was the star of the show, but like, gender recognition didn't even get mentioned, and that happened a month later. And it really it's so obviously it's so good that it passed, and it is something we got to be so proud of, and it was a beacon of light and hope at a time where everybody needed it, LGBTQ or not. But it was also bloody hard, and as the folks who would have gone on to the next referendum can attest, it's really difficult to knock on doors and ask for equality or ask for basic access to healthcare. So I suppose I just sort of wanted to name that, so because I think it's a real part of the conversation. obviously that ties very much into the unfinished business piece, which is the big kind of, well, there's lots of them and we'll go through them, but obviously the fact that not all LGBTQ plus families are equal with the law yet. So there's still work to be done, and there are still pieces, and there are certain types of families that still need recognition. Obviously, for our trans brothers and sisters and non-binary folk, there's still a lot of work around access to healthcare and even the gender recognition itself. You know, I mean, will I go on with the laundry list?
Please do, yes, and make this a free for all.
Sorry, Tonie, what were you saying?
Yes, please do.
Yeah, no, I mean, obviously, and you know, thank you for referencing GCN, because one of the priorities that myself and the team have really kind of decided to be very to put all our energy into is to platforming and amplifying and spotlighting what is going on for people and what they do need to talk to one another and the wider society about. And you know, and we're not there yet. I mean, if you talk to Belong To or young LGBTQ plus folks, there's a lot of homophobia and transphobia still. There's a lot of challenges, even in the coming out process. You know, COVID, the pandemic has had a profound effect on young people's ability to even come out. You know, we would know a lot of university, you know, the old coming out in your first year of university, that whole rite of passage has been denied in this past year. So, and you know, people are in precarious home situations. Obviously, we have a housing and homelessness crisis that affects LGBTQ plus folks. So yeah, there really are so many things still. And I guess the thing that we know that we need to do is make sure that, you know, marriage equality doesn't get sort of rose tinted into a little neat sting, because it was the start, you know, it was the start of a process, not the end.
Yeah, I think, you know, the enumeration of the list, and maybe it is a list, but, you know, there are some things around the legacy. There's the legacy of the vote. And I think the legacy of the vote was to give people, particularly in our community, an optimism that actually, I mean, I remember travelling up to Donegal the week after the vote, and we travelled through a town that I have to say, I always had a sense that, Jesus, I wouldn't like the car to break down here, lads. You know, I wouldn't like to be going into a B&B asking for a room because they'd be saying, 2 sisters, are you? Oh, yeah, we have a room for you, but you'd have to share a bed. It was one of those towns, but actually driving through it 4 or 5 days after the referendum, the post office in this small town in Donegal was covered in yes equality stickers and posters. And it made me stop and think, Jesus, that is fantastic. I can now go to parts of Ireland and I'll think, you know, 60% of the people actually voted to say I'm okay and I belong and I feel good about that. So there was that kind of legacy of an optimism of the vote. Also the belief in the power of democracy, of referendums, that a small group of people could organise and win a referendum on a topic that in many ways only affected such a small group of people, and to get the people out behind us. I think that was huge. There was also a legacy, and Brian will maybe speak to this more, the number of young people that, and not just young, but predominantly young, who cut their teeth on marriage equality, knocking on the doors, learning to campaign and liking it. And I do think you're either that kind of person who, I like knocking on doors, talking to people saying, excuse me, I'm Gráinne, I'm voting yes. Can I tell you why? I liked doing that and did quite a bit of it during the campaign just because I liked being out there. And a lot of those people, I'm now seeing those when I look at councillors in Dublin City Council or other councils around the country. I'm seeing the faces of people who were part of the 70 yes equality groups. I'm seeing them in the Soc Dems in particular. I'm seeing them in Labour. I'm seeing them even in some of the parties that I wouldn't maybe be voting for myself, you know, Fine Gael, Fianna Fáil and others. So it was a kind of a cutting of their teeth. And then we've already mentioned the repeal. A lot of people who were part of marriage equality went on to be big supporters and to win the full reproductive rights for women in Ireland. So there's some of the kind of the good legacy things, but I want to add maybe to some of what Lisa was saying. I mean, I did a piece of research with our colleagues in Australia when they were fighting their marriage equality row, which was about a preferendum, not even a bloody referendum, but a preferendum as to whether or not they would allow same-sex marriage there. And I did a piece of research with some feminist researchers from Australia. And in that, we did a piece of research which people can look up. We called it Swimming with Sharks. And we called it Swimming with Sharks because it captured exactly what Lisa's describing. We got 1,000 Irish people who had been involved in the campaign to talk about what was it like. Because we could do it then, it was over. And we got stories of people saying they took a different route to school every morning because they had 2 kids in the back of the car. And when the kids saw the no posters, they were saying, why is that saying we need a daddy? Why is that saying, asking those questions? People were upset. People were spat on the doorsteps. People were put out of their family homes. So it wasn't all sunny, happy, clappy, really easy to do. So that's kind of part of the story. And that research, we tried to capture that because it was after it and we probably couldn't do it during it because it was just too bloody hard and we were focused on winning. The other thing I want to add to the list is, the hurt, families is unfinished business. COVID has just made it worse for so many people. But there's also, the importance of the international solidarity. A lot of stuff is still moving in the same direction. There are people in Ireland who have been left behind. But, I'm really worried about parts of Europe. I'm worried about Hungary. I'm worried about Poland. I'm worried about these countries that are supposedly part of a European Union that has this shared set of values. And they are turning the dial back on the human rights of LGBTQ plus people in particular. And I'm really worried about those. And Ireland was never in a better position to push our foreign ministers to really stand up for those rights in the spaces where they can say the things that need to be said.
Brian, this is a good point actually to bring you in, Brian, because of your experience in Brussels. I mean, where do you think Ireland stands as a beacon for progressive change? And how can we use even our soft power in terms of our relationships with other countries in Europe, as Gráinne is suggesting?
So I think there's a couple of things. First of all, this is actually about social and economic justice. It's not just about rights for LGBT people. And we always have to keep that in mind. If we don't, then it is just a matter of climbing up on the backs of somebody else. This is always a social and economic justice issue. And it's where Glenn said, the full and equal participation in all aspects of Irish life, right? So there's a couple of little stories. And Tonie, you're in Turkey, I'll pick up that, right? For anybody who'd like to listen, look up Rainbow Europe. ILGA Europe is the International Lesbian Gay Association Europe, as Tonie said earlier. ILGA Europe each year around Ida Hobbit Day produce a map of where we are, right, in Europe and Central Asia. So Ireland's at 52% of what the package of full rights and entitlements for people who are LGBTI or non-binary would have access to. Ireland's at 52%. The top of the list is Malta at 89%. Turkey is at 4%. So I did a lot of travel around Europe with the work with ILGA Europe, and Gráinne, Mark Kelly from the ICCL and I were trotting our stuff in a pride parade shortly after the referendum passed with, I don't know, pick a number, 100,000 people, delighted with where we were, LGBTI and others, right? It was fantastic. And I went about a month later to Istanbul for their pride parade, where there was more, like it was banned. The trans pride parade the previous week had been attacked by police. There was a terrible atmosphere of real fear, and the activists, incredibly brave activists, stood in a square and tried to read out a statement about their pride parade being cancelled, and the police beat them up, and it was terrible, right? So that's it. Our job is not done until that's sorted. But I will say one thing. A friend of mine who runs an organization in Armenia, and Gráinne met her because Gráinne then came to the ILGA Europe annual conference in October, and I think people were beyond moved by what Irish people had done. It wasn't about us; it was Irish people. So there's a friend of mine who runs an organization in Armenia, and who gets things like the police raided and destroyed their premises on a regular enough basis. And she said that in her entire life as an activist, if the situation didn't get worse for LGBTI people, that would be a success in her environment. That's how difficult. But what sustained her and was going to sustain her for an awful long time was the belief and the knowledge that Irish people, in their utter freedom to make a choice, said yes. And it's that faith in, like, if I round it back, our very first poster in the marriage referendum was a big post that said, loving, equal, decent, fair. There was a fifth word, which I've forgotten, but these are the qualities of Irish people. Generous. These are the qualities of Irish people. And can you just give us the yes? And that is true. Irish people were always miles ahead of the politicians on this and many other things we saw on repeal, for example. So the belief that there are people who are good if they're able to be their better selves and will support LGBTI people is what keeps people like my friend in Armenia going. And I think we can either... one very quick comparison. Black Lives Matter erupted this time last year, actually before this, but in a huge way last year with George Floyd. And I think what it did is uncover for people who hadn't quite seen the awful institutionalization of racism and classism and everything else in America. And it was hidden in utterly plain sight. And the same is happening here and the same is happening in Europe. The situation of LGBTI people is the utterly hidden in plain sight of the disadvantage and discrimination to loads of people, whether that's by class or race or membership of the traveling community or a range of issues that are areas that we look at and ignore. But as Gráinne says, if we don't worry also about Polish LGBTI people or Turkish LGBTI people or in Azerbaijan or a place like that where your life is in danger, then our project is of naught because all we've done is make ourselves comfortable, and that's not
exactly
enough.
Yeah.
Fair point, and I think this is a perfect opportunity to actually open questions to the floor. Are you there, Bridge? Yeah, I'm just wondering if anyone would like to actually address a question to any of the panel or all of the panel.
Maybe there's nobody on the call. We're talking to ourselves, maybe.
Okay.
Just Tonie, maybe just say while we're waiting on a question to come in, some of the processes that the Irish government have kind of put in place over the last couple of years, and I'm like Lisa. I mean, I think acknowledging the at the time historic gender recognition legislation, the importance of that, not just for the specific people, but for all of us as a country to acknowledge the importance of that. But Ireland has produced the first inclusive strategy for LGBTI plus people. I think it was last year it was published, and that again is a first in Europe. Now the implementation of it is what they'll be judged by. But I was part of the consultants that they brought together to go around the country and do the consultation process on it, and indeed the subsequent hate crime legislation. And I have to say, going around talking to people, some of them long-time activists, other people who just came out who wanted to talk, there is a sense, speaking maybe to what Brian was saying, there is a sense that there is an expectation among the plain people of Ireland that Ireland will stand. I mean, what happened last week over Palestine in Ireland, I think that's emblematic of the way good thinking, right thinking, the majority of Irish people think, which is if something is unfair, it really needs to be fixed. And we're used to standing up, stood up to the Brits for 800 years. We can stand up to other forces. So I do think that there is, and it's about harnessing that. It's about having political parties that give a space for people like that, not let it turn to the kind of cynicism and and sadness that you see in the UK at the moment, where there is a real sense of politics doesn't matter, activism doesn't matter, we're all going to hell in a handbasket, so let's just forget it. I think we haven't got to that point. I think there's still an energy and an enthusiasm and a thirst for justice. And I see it. I saw it in those consultations, and I see it. I'm doing work at the moment on a new domestic sexual and gender-based violence strategy. And similarly, talking to people, and they're saying, we want an ambitious strategy, and we want that for Ireland, and we want it for ourselves, for our kids, for whoever's coming up after us. So there is something that we do in carrying that, pushing that idea of wanting justice and equality and fairness. I don't know if it's in the DNA, but certainly our mothers and our fathers passed it down to us.
There's also something else you're describing so beautifully, and that's in terms of the political process and agitation. Success begets success. We achieve certain amounts, and it gives. I think you've beautifully described how we create a hunger to just keep pushing on. And you know what? I often when I'm on Twitter, I have a hashtag a model republic. I still subscribe to the notion that we've yet to finish the business of 1916, and I don't mean every united country. I mean building a modern secular republic. And I think all of the things that you just described, and Celia described, various processes, the engagement, the duty of care to groups and people outside of Ireland, particularly as well, that these are all part of the bigger process of just simply imagining a better life for all of us. Can I? I'm going to
something. Can I come in something very brief there? Because I think it's really interesting. One of the things that links our three organizations is resources, right? And we had resources through Atlantic Philanthropies. Gráinne has mentioned them already. And in fact, a tiny bit of seed funding went to LGBT Noise from Atlantic Philanthropies. And there's a really interesting piece there. The reason we were able to make progress was because we didn't have to spend a lot of time trying to raise small amounts of money. And there's an interesting about how a government when you talk about the model republic, what the role of government is in actually funding organizations that seek to change the republic that they're governing. And it's a really difficult one for government. And I think it's like, it goes back to where Lisa, where you started out. How do you fund thorns in your side? And I'm using that language. I'm not trying to put words in your mouth, but I think it's really interesting. Because Noise became this organization with no resources and slightly outside the mainstream and therefore not resourced. And it's a really interesting one. If you go back to the bit about afflicting the comfortable, like at one level, we have to recognize that we have to resource those groups and organizations and communities that are looking for what really are basic rights, And I think there's a real challenge in how a state does that, but also in the absence of Atlantic Philanthropies, who are enormously important, and indeed Community Foundation for Ireland, who were very early into this field a long time ago and did enormous work funding small organizations around the country brilliantly. Like, who and where does the community get resources to drive the change that Lisa so well outlined earlier?
Mm-hmm. And that driving of resources, I mean, Lisa might come in on this. I mean, a couple of years ago, Denise Charlton and myself were running this leadership program for NGOs. And in our view, if you don't feed and grow the people, like most of the stuff that I did over my life, I did in my volunteering capacity. I was teaching, but at night I was going to meetings and agitating and doing whatever. And the same during marriage equality and yes equality. And at some of those training programs, and Lisa was part of one of them, it was brilliant to see these young men and women, many of them young, coming forward and saying, I want to lead. I want to be the voice leading. And I know there's feck all resources for me to have a staff, but actually I want to lead. And I found it was a wonderful experience, facilitating some of those groups. And Lisa, I know you participated in that, but maybe it's just say something about resources and the lack of them and how you keep going.
Yeah. I mean, I think that what's really interesting if you read GCN's website or the print when we have it at the moment, certainly younger LGBTQ plus folks, particularly, there's a lot of feeling of fatigue and burnout. And the fact is that there are so many challenges. They feel very insurmountable. I mean, we have, if I may apply a broad stroke, we largely have a government none of us voted for. You know, it's not an ideal setting for loads of change. And you know, and I know particularly for really intersectional minorities and identities, they're tired of having to be, okay, well, I'm the person of color who's queer, and I know I need to carry the can for my type of person, or to do all that literal work in terms of activism, but also the emotional labor of just existing in the world as a person who is that. And you know, so in terms of resourcing, it's actually it's you know, arguably we're getting to a point where it is going to be so important going forward, because look at the young folks doing the climate strikes. I mean, they give me a lot of hope, because it's literal teenagers going, listen, lads, I don't know what the F you were doing for 20, 30 years, but this is really wrong.
It's over.
And actually, you know, and there's a real, and I think, you know, really, really wanting to completely break the structures, because they actually need breaking. And I think we queers have always led the way around that, because we're kind of over here going, there's a better way to do this, folks, and there's a different way. And you know, and I think that is going to have to permeate, because you know, if we want this planet to not die, and I'm sorry to do that on this call, because I know it's supposed to be you know, a celebratory moment, but you know, and I went to some of the school strikes for Fridays pre-pandemic, and honestly, goosebumps hearing 16 and 17-year-olds speak so eloquently and powerfully about what needs to happen. And actually, Brian mentioned it earlier, the people are you know, in Ireland, for as long as I've been around, the people are always way ahead of our government, and way ahead of the kind of puny, conservative, whiny, small-minded, like, oh, will I keep my seat? It's done. Like, we're toast, lads. Stop worrying about your next election. And that's why I am hopeful. I'm glad that you're seeing the folks who were banging the doors for repeal in councils, because I need a bit of hope for the next people I'm going to vote for.
A question from the room. Lisa, well, it's addressed to all of you, but Lisa, could you tell us a particular standout memory of the campaign that has stayed with you?
Well, obviously, the old day at the Dole was pretty fun. Myself and Will St. Ledger having causing ructions. I know. A standout memory. Ooh, I mean, I guess one thing I'd like to mention that Gráinne referenced earlier is that, like, one of the really early things that Noise was concerned with as well in our milieu was actually being in Panty Bar of a Friday giving out flyers and being absolutely either laughed out of it or told to piss off,
ignored,
you know, there is, or ignored, or like, you're bonkers, get out of my face. And really, the work that we did within amongst ourselves, I don't think the rest, the 62% didn't see that work because they weren't there, and it wasn't their time. But that's the stuff that stays with me, because that was the really hard stuff, like, or crazy things like letting Rory O'Neill talk me into doing AMI in order to basically performance art activists have a moment and put marriage equality in front of a captive audience. And I mean, it was bonkers, because it was like 6 weeks out and suddenly I was in AMI. And I mean, obviously that's fabulous in its own way, but you know, that was just wild to me. So really my memories are of the sort of lead up, because the referendum, it's like, I think when you're an activist as well, when everyone gets on board, you're like, okay, you know. And normally, if you're dyed in the wool like me, you're going, what's the next thing? So, you know.
Brian, standout moments for you are actually just reflecting back 6 years later. Is there anything you would have done differently?
Oh, Jesus, lots. Look, there's no awful lot you do differently, but we won, right? So you can. One of the things I think, because it goes to, like, I've loads of standout moments, and Gráinne and I have talked about some of those, but one I think that I'll always remember is, and this is the extraordinary generosity of people all across the world. So on the day of the vote, people were flying in from everywhere, and there was a boat to vote coming from the UK. They gathered all over the place. The train drivers and everything they all gathered in trains in London. They joined all the way. They got on the boat in Holyhead and they came in, and they arrived in on the morning of the vote into Dublin. And Una Murphy, isn't it? Was it Gráinne? Got up on the deck as the boat came into Dublin, and she sang "She Moved Through the Fair."
Mm.
And it
wasn't a dry eye in the house.
It wasn't dry, and it was incredibly beautiful. Such a beautiful song, and it's incredibly beautiful because somehow or other it captured the sacrifice and the willingness that people had to really put themselves out for something they believed in. These were not people necessarily who were LGBT. It's just they had emigrated, and this is the country they wanted to come back to. It goes right back to Lisa's point. We need a government. We have a housing crisis that's like decades of pathetic housing policies and a continuation of the same. We have to build a country where people want to live. That was the moment. It echoes Gráinne's point of all those people who should now be leading us. That was the moment when you thought, this is hope for the country, not just our referendum. That I think stands out for me always. It's also because I wept like an idiot, but that's beside the point.
Gráinne, standout moment for you before we finish.
That was certainly one. I think during the campaign, there were times, there were I was chairing marriage equality meetings weekly for 12 years. So there are moments during that 12 years where you come out and you think, I'm going to the pub because this is a bloody waste of time. I don't know why I'm doing this. And then something else happens and you go off. But I guess, the moment when it seemed to me, everybody, a bit like Lisa's point, everybody else was suddenly going to come on board, was the day of the vote in the Constitutional Convention, when 79% of the people said, let's put it to the people. 79% of them told Enda Kenny he was to have a referendum. And I remember going into Pantybar in from Malahide, and it was packed, it was mobbed, and suddenly I realized there was now this mob of people who were saying, Jesus, the Citizens' Assembly thinks we can do it. Now, for us, the next day was waking up and thinking, Jesus, we have to fight a referendum now, lads. We're only starting. But there was something in Pantybar that day of a sense of, this is it. This is actually it. It's on the mainframe agenda. And we can do it. If 79% and 81% of them voted that children in LGBT families should have their rights vindicated, 81%. So, as you can see, I'm a big fan of Citizens' Assembly and constitutional conventions ever since then.
I think that's an actually beautiful thought to actually finish our panel discussion for tonight. Really chuffed for everyone who's in the room that you could actually join us. I really want to thank our panelists, Brian Sheehan, Lisa Connell, Dr. Gráinne Healy, Vanessa, our sign interpreter, and all the staff at the National Library of Ireland. And we're going to be back again with another panel discussion around this time, the end of June. We're going to talk about the history and evolution of Dublin Pride, and also ask some hopefully trenchant questions about its value and even its commodification. You can find all that information on nli.ie. Thank you very much, all of you, for joining us.
Thanks to you, Tonie.
Good night. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Thanks, Tonie.